Well, thank you for the introduction, but even more, thank you for the invitation, and thank you very much for organizing this event, which I find particularly interesting. This conversation, I think, is much needed, and I see many people whose work I respect and admire. I decided many years ago never to speak about what's going on in Israel and Palestine, because I decided first that it would require competence that I do not have, and second, that I was a little bit tired of getting beaten up in different ways. But I realized recently that even when you don't talk about it, you can still be attacked, which has been my case recently, as I was associated in one sentence with Hamas for being responsible for the death of a teacher in France. And I believe it's not the case. What's interesting is that the phrase complicity with terrorism, which has been used against academics in France, including myself, intellectual complicity with terrorism, this phrase hasn't been used for Renaud Camus, which is quite remarkable given what you just reminded us of, attacks like that in Christchurch and in El Paso. What I want to do in this presentation is to pay attention to this intellectual logic of anti-intellectualism, which plays a central role, I think, in the so-called, and I will explain that, theory of great replacement. I will focus quite a bit on Renaud Camus, but what I want to suggest is that, in fact, there's a string of writers, as most of us are familiar with. There's a book that recently came out in Canada, which is called Les déclinistes ou le délire du grand remplacement. It's by a man named Alain Bois. And what's interesting is that there's a list of names with Renaud Camus, Alain Finkielkraut, Éric Zemmour, Mathieu Bock-Côté, an import from Quebec, Houellebecq, Onfray. So you have a list. And in fact, what is interesting is the circulation of vocabulary between these different authors. Now, let me start with something I hadn't planned to discuss, but given the context and also given the fact that I think it fits in with my general argument about the inversion of language, the word turned upside down, let me start with the question of anti-Semitism in current debates, polemics in France and in much of the world. We are very much exposed to the idea that we have to choose sides, that is, either focus on one or on the other. And in particular, this is an argument that has been prevalent on the right and on the far right, but not only. I want to use the example of Renaud Camus, but also of all these people that talk about grand remplacement to show that they don't need to make that choice. Interestingly, they manage to be both anti-Semitic and Islamophobic. The most obvious example is that of Renaud Camus himself. In 2000, he complained in his diary that is published that there were too many Jews on France Culture, which seems easy enough to recognize as an anti-Semitic trope. But who defended him but Alain Finkielkraut, who thought that there was I'm not sure how to translate that, Barrès-like melancholy in his approach, and that it was becoming impossible to live in a country where people were so quick to be indignant. Now, of course, the reference to Barrès is interesting because Barrès is, in many ways, the embodiment of anti-Dreyfusism. And so clearly for Finkielkraut to say that Barrès is a good guy, and so is Camus, was somewhat unexpected. But in fact, this tendency of Finkielkraut towards, who's one of the people close to Renaud Camus, influenced by Camus, and by the way, I should add, he was one of the Jewish people on France Culture. So I assume he thought others were too many, but he was just the right size. But Finkielkraut has more recently, or a few years later, in 2013, discussed on France Inter, the French public radio, saying that there was a woman who said to him, "Je suis aussi française que vous. I'm as French as you are," which is a direct quote from Renaud Camus. And he said, and what is interesting is that when Camus says that, he says, "Of course I'm more French than she is. I'm more French than a veiled woman who barely can speak French and who has no culture, no mastery of the language, whereas I'm a cultured French man, français de souche." In the case of Finkielkraut, it's more unexpected because he says in the first person, yeah, I am French, obviously, but I'm not quite as French as some other French, the French that we dare not call français de souche, of French stock, because I was not born French. So he became French, I think at the age of 2 or something like that. And he's now in the French Academy. That was the year before he joined the French Academy, was elected. But still, he was not quite French enough. So the perversion of this language of souche, that is the origin, means that it's not just someone like Renaud Camus who can claim that he embodies a sort of eternal Frenchness, but that Finkielkraut, in order to agree with him, has to go further and say, well, I know I don't quite belong. So this anti-Dreyfusisme is something that I think has not been emphasized enough and that I want to insist on a bit more. In fact, one of the most obvious cases, although paradoxical as well, is that of Éric Zemmour, who's also Jewish, but who's been systematically anti-Semitic in his pronouncements. For example, rehabilitating Vichy, which is, again, a clear signal of where you stand on these issues, but also quoting, talking about General Bugeaud in colonization and saying, you know, because I'm French, I have to be on the side of General Bugeaud. Of course, he murdered many Algerians, and he did murder quite a few Jews, but because I'm French, I'm on his side. So in order to vindicate colonization, in order to vindicate the treatment of Arabs and Muslims, some Jewish intellectuals are willing to go so far as to vindicate anti-Semitism. It goes very far in the case of Zemmour, for example, because he claims that the children who had been assassinated as Jews in France, because they were buried in Israel, it showed that they were not really French. And when he was criticized as anti-Semitic by the great rabbi of France, he said that the great rabbi was cosmopolitan and not French. So all the tropes of anti-Semitism are there, and what is remarkable is that it is not discussed more, as if the necessary choice were between fighting Islamophobia or fighting anti-Semitism, or being Islamophobic or being anti-Semitic. I should add in the case of Zemmour that, and it's a more indirect case of anti-Semitism, but I interpret it as such. When he declared his candidacy for president, there was a video, and I appeared briefly, fortunately briefly, but next to Bernard-Henri Lévy and Jacques Attali. And of course, these two are whose politics I radically disapprove of, but these two are always the targets of anti-Semitic comments. And basically, he's saying, these are the people who are traitors to the nation. So it was, even though I'm not Jewish, in a way, it worked, because intellectuals, elitist, cosmopolitan, not French, etc. Now, let's look at someone like Houellebecq. Houellebecq, who follows in that tradition, and I will talk a bit more about the book Submission. In the book of exchange, letters exchanged with Bernard-Henri Lévy in 2008, he really admires Céline. He says, yeah, no, he's a good novelist without genius, but he's really excellent when he writes pamphlets. And in case you didn't get it, or in case Bernard-Henri Lévy didn't get it, he says some of the pages of his anti-Semitic texts are so cruelly funny. His hatred is irresistible. What is interesting is that Bernard-Henri Lévy does not have one word of response to that. It's as if it hadn't been written in the book that they're co-signing, which means basically you have to have priorities in life. Whom do you hate most? And basically, the whole argument by Zemmour is one against Arabs, Muslims, etc. So nobody's perfect. And of course, he says, I've always felt, without any biographical reason, on the side of Jews, which is surprising because people who are on the side of Jews tend not to be great fans of Céline's anti-Semitic pamphlets. But I want to argue that the solution for this apparent contradiction, which is not specific to Houellebecq, which you find in many of these authors, is Zionism. That is anti-Semitic, but Zionist. That's exactly what Onfray said in 2012 as he wrote a review in Le Point of a book that was clearly anti-Semitic, of an form of anti-Judaism theoretically justified. And when he was attacked for that, his response was to quote a text that he'd written before saying that he was a Zionist. So he was not disputing the anti-Semitism, but he was claiming the Zionism. This strange combination, or so I think, is also to be found in Renaud Camus himself. A few days ago, after Hamas attacked Israel, the Israeli population, he wrote a tweet that was published both in French and in English in the name of his group, the National Council of European Resistance. The National Council of European Resistance fully supports Israel in the face of the cowardly and barbaric attacks to which these deeply loved state and people are subject. Israel, and this is the point that I want to emphasize, one of the oldest nations on the face of the earth, is the model of all belonging. If Israel does not belong to the Jews, there's no longer any deep reason for France to remain to the French and Europe to the Europeans. We must act as this power acts, not as too many of its misguided people over the world say. So what he's saying is that the reason why he favors Israel, it's precisely because it's a state. And in a way, what he's saying is Jews belong in Israel, just like the French belong in France, just like et cetera, et cetera. So belonging is the issue. And that's where the contradiction is somehow resolved. I mean, not exactly in my opinion, but at least in his. And of course, the comparison is something that he develops because he says that he tweeted a few days ago that France is just like Israel, but with a pro-Palestinian government, an anti-Semitic media, and an anti-Semitic justice system. So basically, France is a replication of Israel, but in a worse condition because we're betrayed by the elites, and in particular, by intellectuals. Now, I want to conclude this section by quoting Fanon, who said that when you hear evil said about the Jews, you should pay attention. They're talking about you. That's what his teacher in Martinique was saying to the students. And so the conclusion was an anti-Semite is necessarily a negrophobe. I'm translating literally. I'm not sure how it sounds in English, and I apologize if it doesn't sound right. But of course, this formulation is reversible. There's a writer, Chloé Cormont, who wrote the same thing but turned around, saying any racist enterprise is a threat to the Jews. So I think it is interesting in this context to see how there has been this opposition, this distinction that makes it possible to hide the profound anti-Semitism of this movement because, well, at least they're saying bad things about Arabs and Muslims. I had originally considered that I would speak about gender and decided after I heard Lou Mousset talk about it that I would risk repeating what she said in a different conference. And so I decided, let's forget about gender. But I eventually found a theoretical reason for doing that, for the moment at least. And I want to speak about what happened in 2013. You had Dominique Vénère, a historian of the far right, who committed suicide in Notre Dame. This was the last week or so of the mobilization against same-sex marriage in France. So big Catholic demonstrations, and some in the media whose Catholic culture is limited thought that it was a Catholic gesture to commit suicide in a cathedral near the altar. Well, quick reminder, no. And in fact, Dominique Vénère is anything but a Catholic, or was anything but a Catholic. He's a pagan figure and claims a sort of Greek heritage, which includes, of course, a relation to what is considered Greek love. And this is important because the attempt then to sort of save him from this Catholic interpretation was proclaimed by none else than Renaud Camus. He was the one who read a text in front of Notre Dame in honor of Renaud Camus, and indeed, in honor of Dominique Vénère, and indeed Dominique Vénère had, in his last message, referred to great replacement, making it clear that it was not about gay marriage. And of course, one could imagine that Renaud Camus was not the best person to criticize gay marriage, as he was the author of Tricks. He could have a sort of radical left critique of marriage, but clearly he's not part of the radical left. And so what is interesting is that it pointed out that the Catholic reference was not a religious one, it was a cultural one. And part of the reason why gender is left out by Camus, aside from his personal history, is an argument that he keeps making about demography. Demographic anxiety is not to be addressed by having more children. On the contrary, fewer children, and he makes this as a sort of environmental principle, a Malthusian defense of no children or few children. So the argument about race suicide, which has a long history, is usually associated with the idea that we should have more children. In that case, it's the opposite. So it's really not a demographic argument in that sense, it's more a cultural argument. In his speech, the couple of days after Vénère's suicide, he insisted on the fact that this was all an homage to the fight against great replacement, which he called then ethnic substitution. He quoted Brecht, the joke by Brecht, the irony by Brecht, if the government are not happy with the people, they might as well change the people. And he says that's what they're doing all the time. That's what politicians are doing all the time. That is basically, grand remplacement is the response to the fact that people don't like what politicians are doing. And he says, why are politicians doing that? Well, on the left, it's because they need these voters. People wouldn't vote for them if it weren't for Arabs and black people. And on the right, it's because of economic interests. And there you can see a theme that is very important. I mean, the idea that this is ruled by money. And of course, when you say that, you don't need to mention Jews. You don't need to do that anymore because it's implicit and it works. Now, in that speech, again, one thing he says is the argument that he had recently developed in his speech on Great Replacement that had been published before. It was about colonization, counter-colonization. And what he says, what is it? Well, it's a reversal of colonization. And we have to reverse this reversal. So colonization is immigration. immigration is colonization, and we have to reverse this. What I want to develop now is this politics of inversion, of reversal. Let me start, because it's a battle about language that I will try to pay attention to. Let me start with an opinion poll that was published by a business magazine, Challenge, in 2021, and the result was that 67% of people believe in and fear great replacement theory. What's interesting, of course, is the idea of believing, which is not exactly what a theory is supposed to be about. I mean, it's supposed to be in part about demonstrations and about hypotheses and conclusions, et cetera, et cetera. And it's part of a battle about words that has been going on. For example, when people in France have talked about la théorie du genre, which is called in other languages the ideology of gender, it's a way of saying, oh, it's just a theory. So it's a little bit like Darwinism. It's just a theory. And creationism is another theory. And great replacement, well, it's a theory. So the use of the word theory is the key, the paradoxical key to anti-intellectualism, which happens through language. So what does it mean that 67% of the people who responded to the poll believed in and feared great replacement? What's interesting is that the editors of the magazine wanted to be very rigorous and precise. And they said, we thought hard about how to phrase the question on great replacement. And they say, it has been used by Eric Zemmour, and there are so many falsehoods and so many things that are counterfactual, etc. So, they quote, certain people talk of great replacement. European populations, white and Christian populations being threatened with extinction following because of Muslim immigration from the Maghreb and Black Africa. Do you think such a phenomenon will happen in France? And they brag about the fact that the wording is taken from Renaud Camus. So basically, if you want to be absolutely objective about great replacement, you should use the words of Renaud Camus because you're not distorting the facts. In fact, this to me is part of this politics of language that has been developing on the far right, that is precisely imposing a language, but also dissolving language. And this echoes, I think, the argument of Cécile Alduy, who's, I think, joining us this afternoon on the dissolving of meaning through language. And this, she says, about Zemmour. Well, my argument is that it's not specific to Zemmour, it's the whole great replacement, and beyond that, it's all the neo-fascist vocabulary that I have talked about in a talk a couple of days ago. So if we don't call it a theory, that is, if we try not to replicate the way it is used by those who speak about the theory of great replacement, what could we say? Well, I would say a slogan. It's about words. Some say a myth. Why not? But I would say just a slogan because it works like that. It has a political function. It's words with a political function. And it's something that is based on reversal, inversion. And let me take another first-person example. In 2013, at Christmas time, I received a letter at home with Islamophobic comments, but that also included, for the first time, because I had received the same letter before, but this time there was a drawing, which was a replica of a poster of the resistance in 1943 that said, wherever they are, whatever they do, traitors will be punished. And you had gallows to sort of make clear that the punishment was serious. And there was, what is even more interesting is that there was the de Gaulle cross, I'm not sure how it's called in English, Croix de Lorraine, which sort of was unexpected because the far right has not always been so enthusiastic about de Gaulle after the end of the Algerian War. But in fact, the pamphlet that I received had a quote that is attributed to de Gaulle and that is always used by the far right, saying a very racist, Islamophobic comment by de Gaulle, who's saying, of course, Colombey les deux églises, his native village, could never become Colombey les deux mosquées, the two mosques. So I want to show this language of inversion briefly, because I'm aware of time. I want to show briefly the use of language with Houellebecq as well. And just a very simple example, when we talk about submission, his novel is the very word submission, because in fact, it can play on different levels. It's an echo of Ayaan Hirsi Ali's film from 10 years earlier, which was about Islam. But is it about Islam exactly? Well, it is in a way, because it's submission to Allah, but it's also submission of women to men, and that makes it easy to have a transition to us, that is non-Muslims, and in particular, collaborators. That is basically those who facilitate the advent of political Islam. And those are people who criticize Islamophobia, for example. But this, again, is a continuation of Renaud Camus. In the speech that he made in front of Notre Dame, he said the remplacistes, those who support this theory of grand remplacement, who support grand remplacement, they're the promoters and agents of grand remplacement. They believe they protect cleverly those who replace us in innumerable numbers. There will soon be their protégés converted, dhimmis, lackeys. And so all this vocabulary you find with Renaud Camus, but you find every day on social media. I'm regularly called dhimmi, and so I had to look up the word because I was not so familiar with that part of history, and so I've sort of caught up with insults. Now, I want to pay a bit more attention to Renaud Camus' theory of language, which I think is interesting. He claims kratylism from Plato's Cratylus. And I will explain this a bit. So I mentioned before I'm as French as you are. And he says, sure, the woman who says that with her veil, she's as French as I am, juridically. And this, of course, is the theme that is very much present on the right and the far right, is that they're real French people, and they're Français de papier, that is, those who have a French passport. And for example, we had a few days ago the football player Karim Benzema, who was threatened by a deputy of being deprived of French citizenship as a result of his prayers for babies in Gaza. So at the time, he said, he had a sort of, that's 10 years ago, his view on the law was, let's say, if not moderate, but halfway between a complete opposition to the law and a certain acceptance of the law. So he says that the law, is going astray when it moves away from the reality of things. These days, and that was yesterday, actually, on Twitter, he says the worst assassin and the most efficient terrorist in Western Europe today is not to be found among those who kill teachers, et cetera, et cetera. I will not list because it's not pleasant. The worst assassin, the most efficient terrorist, is the law. International law, European law, and even French law, which forces the destruction of Europeans from Europe. A genocide by substitution, the great replacement. So he's moving forward as time goes. But let me insist on this kratylism, because it's a contradiction that is invoking Cratylus. He's saying the woman who says I'm French, she's just saying conventions matter. You know, Français de papier. But in fact, words are grounded in a history, in a culture, if not in nature. So that's his definition of kratalism, the idea that words are not something that you can change like that. They're not conventions. They cannot be re-signified, and I will come back to this at the end. So instead, in opposition to pure convention, you have to have time, origin, and the origin of that origin. This is a quote. I wouldn't use that phrase. So at the same time, he's criticizing, of course, the language of the people he's opposing. For him, all these people are using antiphrasis, they're using euphemism, lies, etc. But what is interesting is that leads him to talk about Hitler. And of course, that's part of the usual argument that in the end, it always comes back to Hitler. So he criticizes the reductio ad Hitlerum. And what's interesting is his critique of Hitler is, yeah, of course, I mean, it's very bad that he killed all these people, but there's an even greater problem. And the greater problem is that his solid language now doesn't work anymore. And what does that mean? Well, that means that now, and he says it's a perverse reversal of language. It means now that you cannot use the words that he used to use, such as the people. He's given a bad name to all these words. It's the equivalent of what Bernanos wrote when he said that Hitler a déshonoré l'antisémitisme. That was in 1944, that basically he gave a bad name to anti-Semitism. So words like patrie, like racine, héritage, nous. So all the words that have to do with the community have been discredited because of Hitler, and that's one of the main reasons why we should really be unhappy with Hitler. So anything that has been touched by Third Reich rhetoric has really become suspect. But at the same time, what I want to show is that he is using inversion systematically. So the distortion of language that he's using is justified by the fact that it's impossible to say things as they are because there are people who will use Nazism against you, the Nazi card. So, for example, if you look at the quote that opens Le Grand Remplacement, it's a quote from Fanon about subjugation. And so it's a quote about colonization. So he's saying, we are being colonized. And Fanon said it. But what is interesting, and as you know, I mean, the whole argument about colonization and all that is central to his argument. But what is interesting is that it starts as a symmetrical argument. We colonized them, they colonized us. And so we should reverse the reversal. But what he says is, in fact, colonization or counter-colonization works better for what is going on now than for what is usually called colonization. In fact, colonization in general was not colonization. Why not? Well, because apart from Algeria, which is of course an important exception given the history of colonization, apart from Algeria, for the rest, we didn't really colonize people because we didn't have colonies. We basically just have had a few people. So in fact, you reverse the language, and in the end, you deny colonization. It's all about denial, in the same way, of course, for Hitler's language. Of course, you acknowledge that he killed millions, but in the end, you say the real problem for us today is that he perverted language in such a way that people who want to fight Nazism are likely to oppose certain terms like race. In 4 minutes, this for me is part of a broader argument about the politics of anti-intellectualism. Why? Because political anti-intellectualism is premised on a concerted effort to dismantle any reference to truth. It's not just great replacement theory, even though it travels quite well, and Steve Bannon has helped, but it's also the fact that, for example, when you have Kellyanne Conway, who talks about alternative facts during the Trump presidency, it's not the same thing as fake news. Fake news is about lies. Alternative facts is about what Harry Frankfurt, the Princeton philosopher, has called bullshit. That is, bullshit is the fact that it's not meant to have any link with truth. It's something that is supposed to make fun of the possibility of truth. It's entertaining precisely because we're not trying to know how much is true or not. And so fact checkers who spend hours proving that it's false, they lack humor. They're not fun because politics is about ridicule. And of course, political ridicule, which is a phrase used by Brazilian philosopher Marcia Tiburi, political ridicule is a way of ridiculing politics. That is, the farce of politics means that democracy is just a farce. What I want to do now, because I tried to think about all this, and of course I've been working on this anti-intellectualism with a reversal of language when people talk of left McCarthyism, for example. That's not new, that happened at the time of political correctness, but left McCarthyism seems like a symmetrical thing, you know, intolerant people on one side and tolerant people on the other. But it's a false symmetry because McCarthyism was anti-intellectual, as we know with Richard Hofstadter's book. But today, the accusation of left-wing McCarthyism is anti-intellectual. So anti-intellectualism is on the other side. But the reversal doesn't show because it seems to be the same thing. It seems to be just symmetrical, whereas in fact, it's an inversion. To conclude, I will be showing a short video. And it's used to think about what it means, this irony in the use of language. And I've been struggling with words, and I was looking for words with parody, with mimicry, etc. And I decided that I would get lost in the vocabulary because it would require knowing all the literature on the subject. So I decided to simplify it for my own purposes and to say that the video you're going to see, for me, is an example of repetition with a difference. That is, re-signification. But what I have shown in this presentation is very different. Of course, there's irony, but it's not repetition with a difference. I would call it, instead of re-signification, de-signification. That is, in the end, you're not sure exactly if there's any meaning in any of this. And this assault of truth on truth is really what it is about. Can you help me with a video? Because I'm really bad at this. Thank you. It's a video clip from 2019 from a man named Younes, a rap singer, and it's called Le Grand Remplacement, interestingly enough. And so it's a satire of Grand Remplacement. And it has circulated thanks to Renaud Camus that tweeted this. And then there was an article in Breitbart against him. So there were many attacks and all that. But I want to show you, and you will recognize the painting in Le Louvre by Charles Lebrun, Le Chancelier Séguier, a 17th century painting. Thank you.
Je suis parti de chez mes rondas sans un ronga. C'est du peura, pas du reggae. J'ai décidé de me décider, faire de la musique comme Bassidi. Comme Bassidi, comme Bassidi, comme Bassidi, comme Bassidi, comme Bassidi, comme Bassidi, comme Bassidi. Le grand remplacement, c'est ta fille qui me kiffe, qui va me faire des enfants et ils auront mon pif. Je déboule dans dans ta vie comme les trottinettes à Paris. Je veux l'argent des Qataris, monsieur l'agent sur le tatami. Je suis parti de chez mes rondas sans un ronga. C'est du beurre, pas du reggae. J'ai décidé de me décider. Faire de la musique comme Bassidi. 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 Elle veut que je lui fasse un bébé, puis deux, puis trois. Elle veut que je lui dise que je l'aime, puis que j'y crois. Je suis jamais sûr de moi. Quoi, l'amour dure 3 ans? L'amour dure 2 mois. Ouais, l'amour dure 2 mois. Le grand remplacement c'est moi, puis eux, puis toi. Les grands méchants c'est nous, rebeux, renois. Moi perso ça me va, je préfère mourir loup-garou que vivre en villageois, que vivre en villageois. Tu peux vivre ta vie ou regarder la leur sur le net. Pour une bagarre ou un date, j'y vais toujours sans lunettes. Je me fais rare, comme les blancs à Gare du Nord, éphémère. Comme la vie d'un garde du corps, si je mets replay, le son est bon. Sinon, me demande pas, elles sont belles, j'en deviens débile. Je suis trop Matrix et gars, quand je te dis je t'aime, c'est toi ou ton pétard. Je sais plus, je sais pas, pourquoi on sait plus au départ. Dans mes rêves, un keuf me shoot, j'hésite à big rap du shit. Dans mes rêves, un peu de doute, j'hésite pas quand j'ai des dettes. Génération internet, jamais aimé qu'on me note. Je vais percer dans 2 minutes, le décollage est imminent.
Okay, I'll stop here. I'll make just a few comments to underline what may or may not have been heard in this. First, as you can see, the cultural reference is not just in embodying of the French cultural tradition, but also in the look of the cultural people who tend to be aging white men, so my crowd, and they're looking at this with disapproval. That's one thing. There's a reference to the Gare du Nord. I mean, there are several references. Gare du Nord, which is a place which indeed, I mean, when you go to take the subway in Gare du Nord or the train, you know that it is not untrue that whites are relatively rare. But there's also the main thing about grand remplacement is the phrase that he uses, I think, which shows the difference with a so-called theory and, in my view, slogan of great replacement. The idea, and I'll quote exactly just because le grand remplacement, c'est ta fille qui me kiffe. It's your daughter who digs me. I don't know if digs me sounds good. It sounds a bit old-fashioned, but that's the only one I knew at that time. Who's going to have children with me, and they will have my nose. What's interesting is that grand remplacement is one population replacing another. It's not about métissage. It's not about mixed populations, whereas this is about mixed populations. So in a way, it's both demographic, your daughter wants to have children with me, but also it's cultural. I can embody a 17th century painting from Le Louvre with my friends, because actually they're his friends. So I thought that was a way of explaining a bit better and with less complicated words than the ones I was ready to use, the difference between everything I've developed, that is the irony that is based on dismantling meaning, what I have called de-signification, and this, which I believe, a repetition with a difference, is re-signification. Thank you very much, and sorry for being long.
I was interested in cradalism, and if there was a bridge to be made between Camus' interest in Barthes' concept of batmologie from the beginning of his career and his kind of turn to cradalism later, I think. And if you see there being a kind of bridge between the early moment of his career and the later moment of his career, which, the early moment is this kind of structuralist interest in signification and its functioning.
I will respond briefly for lack of competence, but I will say one thing. Yesterday, actually, I saw that Éric Marty, who's another French author who's also inspired by Barthes, who was close to Barthes as well, and who has also veered quite far on the right. That's the advantage of Twitter or the social media formerly known as Twitter, that basically can follow what people are doing quite easily. And so the current context, well, makes people say things quite abruptly, but he makes a direct reference to batmology. So I don't know in the case of Renaud Camus, but clearly there's a feeling that one way of being inspired by Barthes today is on that side. I'm not saying, of course, it's inherent to Barthes, and there are many other ways of using Barthes, but it's one of the ways. And so I don't think it's felt as a contradiction. It's felt as a contradiction by those who still think, of tricks, but obviously no one reads tricks anymore, whereas people do know about great replacement theory. So I don't know much more about this, so I don't want to pretend that I know, but I think there's something interesting to be investigated, and I'm sure some people know much better than I do, but about this use of Barthes.
Thanks for the presentation. I guess I would love for you to say a little bit more about how you define great replacement theory, and where this anti-intellectualism fits into your understanding of it sort of as a broader phenomenon. And then sort of a subset of that is, you had this section on Jews and anti-Semitism, which was very interesting. There's an important anti-racist thinker in this country, Eric Ward, who we've had on this campus a couple of times, who argues that the heart of great replacement theory is anti-Semitism. He's not the only person to argue that. And that the replacing is allegedly being done by Jews, right? Which ties into certain things that happened on the side of the Atlantic in the last 7 or 8 years. And so I'm just wondering whether or not you think that goes too far, whether or not you think there's a French version where certain right-wing Jews have found a way to navigate and therefore they don't see anti-Semitism essential in the same way. Just wondering how you would explain what seems to be another dimension of the paradox.
Well, again, my competence is limited, and I will try not to say it every time because it goes without saying, but still I felt that it was necessary to repeat it. I think that what I have tried to emphasize is first that it's, in some ways, the grand remplacement has displaced the anti-Semitic part of Renaud Camus. That is, it's sort of, people don't talk about it. The ones who are most explicitly anti-Semitic are people like Zemmour, and the fact that he's Jewish is part of the equation. I mean, he can afford, I don't know if he can afford, but at least he's one who's very explicitly anti-Semitic. And I've been fascinated by the jouissance of the far right in having him as a representative who can be openly anti-Semitic and be Jewish, say he's Jewish, fight with the great rabbi, fight with the Krif, etc. So, I mean, there's a far right jouissance in this, which I find particularly perverse. It seems that historically, of course, there's a tradition of this anti-Semitism in the Great Replacement theory, even before Renaud Camus. It has been less visible. That's why I tried to emphasize it today. I think it has been, my impression is that people have paid less attention to it in France. I think it's very much present, but it's obscured again by the sort of radical defense of Israel. So that complicates matters. You know, when you have Houellebecq saying to Bernard-Henri Lévy what he says about Céline, and then what, it complicates matters. And so in a way, I think the way I read it is, oh, well, he's anti-Semitic, but at least he's really a Zionist.
I think you're right.
Yes, hi. About the term anti-Semitic itself, my understanding is that this is kind of a depreciated concept, but the Semitic people are more than just Jewish. And is the use of that term to only apply to Jewish people, is that sort of a subversion or an inversion or a claiming of who are the real Semitic people? Do you know anything about the sort of the history of the term anti-Semitism?
Well, it's a long history that has been studied by others, but one thing that I could say in reference to what I have said in this presentation is that when Bernanos says that anti-Semitism has been sort of delegitimated or déshonoré by Hitler, he says, in any case, I'm not sure what this word means because Semites can also be not just Jews. But precisely, I mean, the shift of words is not entirely reassuring. And it's, I mean, in a way, one could say, of course, yeah, anti-Semitism. I mean, if you look, for example, in opinion polls, I mean, the general argument in France today about the so-called new anti-Semitism is that the new anti-Semitism comes from the banlieue, and it comes from the left and the banlieue. And the banlieue meaning working class, usually of foreign origin, and often Muslim. That's what everyone assumes. Every year, there's a poll conducted, and that's been the case for 20 years, by the CNCDH, which is an institution, a state institution that is supposed to pay attention to racism and et cetera. So there's a big survey every year, and what they find is that there's a strong correlation still between anti-Semitism and right-wing, and not with the left. And of course, probably this would have to be qualified by one thing, which is very important. These are opinions. But in fact, what's happening with anti-Semitism in France usually is not just opinions, it's acts. So if we count the population in general, or if we count acts specifically, we get a different story. So anti-Semitic acts do not represent that population in general, of course, but it depends on the narrative that you have. And so the idea that it's them obscures the fact that all the people I've been talking about who represent clearly an important part of the traditional bourgeoisie. I mean, the people who voted for Zemmour are the traditional bourgeoisie, actually Catholics in particular. So I think, I'm not answering fully your question by far, but I think it's interesting to see how the connection between the two, and you know, for example, in French at the moment, when you say racism and anti-Semitism, you're suggesting that it's two different things. And the question is, of course, it's partly true, including for the reasons I've said, but also it sort of tends in the end to oppose one to the other. And so it's complicated. The question of vocabulary on this issue is part of the politics of all this.
I want to make a generational comment. Thanks. I wanted to make a generational comment and to start with saying something about the video, that we have to say that the video is being playful with imagery and costuming and pace from Hamilton, the musical. And that's something that millennials will pick on and Gen Z people will pick on very quickly. When we say the banlieue, we also mean young people. We don't just mean Muslims, and that there's a difference in context of the way they got their information. They got their information through their phones or through a variety of screens, so that when people make kind of like interesting remarks who are Gen X or Boomer, I don't know how the equivalents apply very well in France, and they're very pointedly bringing up past references and the choice of language they use or the choice of phrasing they use, that in the case of millennials and Gen Z people, they're pulling things just sort of free of context, so that their reuse of important phrases or important tropes may just be anti-authoritarian or anti-establishment or something like that, because I think, I don't know, I want to speak of the banlieue, but they think they're punching up when they're punching at the Jewish establishment or members of the establishment that are Jewish, rather than punching down. What an older generation would think of criticism or attack on Jews as punching down, while that might not be true of a younger generation, because they see them as the people in power, not the people out of power.
Well, you mean in the video, the Jewish references?
I can't follow French very well, so
Because I
can't
didn't
say about that.
find any. I mean, not that I perceived. I'm not saying there were none, but none that I perceived. But I'm interested in the fact that there's a generational dimension in this. Obviously, it's important, and the fact that you're making references that I don't even know sort of only confirms that, unfortunately for me. But what I would say is that at the same time, what I find very striking is the use of the painting. That's what you start with. And in order to recognize that, they're not choosing a sort of complicated painting, one that's in Le Louvre. So basically, it's more or less school culture, which I would call Finkel culture. And I've done that as well in some of my interventions with parodies of Candide or parodies of Montesquieu, etc., precisely because otherwise we're told that's the culture that's going away and it's only appropriated by white people for white supremacist ends. But so I think what they're doing is saying, no, we're quite at ease in this culture. We learned that in school. It was interesting. The teacher took us to see Le Louvre. That's what I see in that thing, which I kind of like. I think it's reassuring about education. Thank you. Thanks very much.